darkmyths.org, Indianapolis Media Group, proudly present to you the Lone Gunman Podcast, featuring your host, Rob Clark, where research comes to shine and myths come to die. Stay tuned. Be right there.
Hello, folks. Happy October to you, and welcome to the Lone Gunman Podcast, episode number 156, Connections You Never Saw Coming. I've got an explosive show for you today, information that's been out there for a while that I've never heard before, and maybe you haven't either, and I'm going to be sharing it with you today. I can't wait to get into this stuff. You know, when you're investigating the assassination of President Kennedy, there are connections to be found all over the place between so many different, what we call key figures in the assassination. And I found a couple more for you today. Some that you're just going to be like, what? What? Are you serious? Yeah, I'm serious. Okay? So let's get right into it, folks. I can't wait to let you in with this. First off, let me say real quick, next month, late November, conference time, your boy will be in Dallas, Texas. That's right. The plane fare has been paid. The hotel booked. And your boy will be in Dallas. So if you'd like to hang out with me, if you'd like to explore Dallas together and all the assassination sites, hit me up at the Lone Gunman 7 on Twitter or at the Lone Gunman Podcast at gmail.com. Send me an email and we can definitely hang and have a great time in Dallas. And we'll see what else we can get into. Maybe even we'll do a podcast together. You never know. Depends on what you want to talk about. Now back to the connections at hand today that I cannot wait to get into you with. We are going to be talking first, folks, about the murder of J.D. Tippit. Now, anybody who's listened to the show knows my feelings on what happened to J.D. Tippit. Personally, I don't believe Lee Oswald killed him. I am of the belief where it seems to me that if there were a conspiracy in this case to set up Lee Harvey Oswald as a patsy, then the individual who actually did kill J.D. Tippit would be none other than Curtis Laverne Crayford. And feel free to go back in the archives and listen to all of my reasons why I believe this is the case. He was Jack Ruby's right-hand man at the time, responsible for many, many of the so-called Ruby Oswald sightings together, and just happens to have the right qualifications, if you will, for the job, and just happens to flee Texas the day after the assassination and try to distance himself as much as possible from everything that happened in Dallas. But like I said, go back and listen to, I believe it's, episode 67, The Ballad of Larry Crayford. And you will see the many, many plethora of reasons why I believe he was impersonating Oswald and was the killer of J.D. Tippit. And there were many witnesses to what happened to J.D. Tippit. As many as 12, I believe, is the official number. But I want to talk about one in particular today. And that man's name is Warren Reynolds. Now, Warren Reynolds happened to be at work that day in his used car lot, Reynolds Motor Company, when someone shot and killed police officer J.D. Tippit. Now, Reynolds heard the shooting and shortly afterwards saw a man running down the street carrying a revolver, emptying shells out of it, trying to tuck it back into his waistband. He pursued the assailant for a block until the man fled out of sight. Within an hour, the Dallas police arrested Lee Harvey Oswald at the Texas Theater and later charged him with the slayings of both Tippit and Kennedy. 2 months passed before Reynolds was finally questioned by the FBI, and although he still recalled the incident vividly, he was unable to positively identify Oswald as the man he chased back in November. Okay. Now, on January 23rd, 1964, just 2 days after his first interview from the FBI, Warren Reynolds was shot in the temple with a .22 rifle in the basement on his used car lot. Miraculously, he lived, and nothing was taken, so police ruled out robbery as a motive. Now, shortly thereafter, authorities picked up a man by the name of Darrell Wayne Garner, who admitted he was at the scene at the time of the shooting. He was held on a charge of assault to murder. Yet on February 5th, Nancy Jane Mooney, 23, signed an affidavit saying that Garner couldn't have shot Reynolds since she was in bed with the suspect at the time of the shooting. On the strength of her alibi and a subsequent polygraph test, the charges against Garner were dropped. Interestingly enough, Mooney told Detective Ramsey of the Dallas police that she had once worked as a stripper for Jack Ruby at the Carousel Club. On February 13th, 1964, just 8 days later, Nancy Jane Mooney was arrested for quarreling with her roommate in a parked car and was taken to the Dallas City Jail at 2:45 a.m. Before 5 a.m., just a mere 3 hours later, she was found dead and her toreador pants wrapped around her neck, her body dangling limply off the floor of her cell. The coroner, Dr. Rose, ruled her death a suicide. For reasons which remain unclear, the Dallas police never informed either the FBI or the Warren Commission of this bizarre Reynolds, Garney, Mooney chain of events. Meanwhile, Warren Reynolds, although lucky to be alive, continued to have problems. 3 weeks after he was released from the hospital, someone tried to entice his 10-year-old daughter into a car. She refused. On another occasion, someone went to considerable trouble to set fire to something on Reynolds' front porch. These events, coupled with his narrow brush with death, had their effect. And when he finally testified before the Warren Commission in July of '64, Reynolds was now prepared to say what he had refused to say in January, namely that it was Lee Harvey Oswald that he saw running past his car lot that day. So, well, that certainly, getting shot in the head will certainly change your mind about things, that's for sure. And very interesting, the connections between Darrell Garner's girlfriend being a former stripper at Jack Ruby's Carousel Club. My, what a small, small world. Another report states, By July of 1964, Reynolds, who had been shot in the head, who had his daughter attempted kidnap, now owned a watchdog, no longer took walks at night, and had his house now ringed with floodlights, testified that he now believed the man was Oswald. The commission, in reporting the changed statements, omitted to mention at that precise point the attempt on Warren Reynolds' life. So, yeah, that might have something to do with it. Moving on, in another report, let's see, sorry, I'm running this through. Yeah, when Reynolds was shot, he was locking up his office for the night and had pushed 2 of the 30 buttons which doused the lights of the establishment when at that time a man rose out of the darkness and shot him in the temple with a .22 caliber rifle. Mr. Reynolds has made a remarkable recovery after doctors had feared permanent loss of speech. A local desperado named Garner was picked up by the police after Reynolds' shooting but was cleared. His girl, Betty McDonald, took a lie detector test that helped spring Garner from jail. 2 weeks ago, she was arrested for engaging in a public brawl with her roommate, and last week she hanged herself in her cell. She had worked as a stripper at a place called the Carousel, Jack Ruby's Carousel. And this is from the New York Journal by Bob Considine on February 23rd, 1964. Now, out of all the people involved in witnessing, being some kind of a witness to the JFK assassination or the murder of J.D. Tippit, we have talked about several prime suspects that could be behind wanting JFK dead. And one of them that we've talked about extensively here on this show is General Edwin Walker, noted right-wing extremist, Kennedy hater, and generally someone whose ideals clashed intensely with that of Democrat John F. Kennedy. He had his reasons. He was removed from his post in Germany in the late 50s, and then for his part in the Ole Miss uprising, he was promptly thrown in a psych ward by Bobby Kennedy. His hatred for the Kennedys was duly noted, and it came out in several of his right-wing speech engagements. So much so that General Edwin Walker planned on dethroning officially John F. Kennedy in the presidential election of 1964 that was coming up. I guess the old saying, by hook or by crook, one way or the other. General Walker had set his sights on the presidency and was officially had tossed his hat in the ring by early 64 and late 63. So he was definitely ramping up towards a personal victory at this point. Why is General Walker important? Well, of course, Lee Harvey Oswald is blamed posthumously for being the person who shot at General Walker in an assassination attempt in early April of 1963. Was this an actual attempt on General Walker's life? Or was this something that Edwin Walker created to garner him some publicity. April 12th, Dallas. In a article in the Dallas Morning News, Walker says shot to spur his crusade. Major General Edwin Walker says that Wednesday, an attempt to kill him will only spur on his anti-communist crusade. Police, meanwhile, say they are without important clues in the shooting at Mr. Walker's home. Whoever shot at the general was playing for keeps, said Detective McElroy. The sniper wasn't trying to scare him, he was shooting to kill. Mr. Walker was sitting in a room at the rear of his house working on his income tax when the bullet missed him by mere inches. It sprayed him with slivers of glass and metal from the window, causing some cuts on his right forearm. A youngster told police he saw several men jump into a car and speed away from the area into a swank part of Dallas. The shooting here is going to speed me up, not slow me down, said Mr. Walker. You know, I said when I came back home that the front lines were right here at home in Dallas. And that's what I meant. So, is this something that maybe Walker orchestrated to garner him some publicity, or is it true that Lee Harvey Oswald was convinced by someone at a party that Edwin Walker needed to be taken out for his extreme right wing beliefs? Now, the FBI uh, tested the bullet recovered from Edwin Walker's wall. Okay. And it was actually made of a different lead alloy than a fragment recovered from the car in which President Kennedy was shot. So the Dallas County investigator Floyd Alexander states he was only able to ascertain the types of guns from which the bullet could have been fired, but that this was speculation on his part. He explained this was due to the fact that he did not have any weapon with which to make a comparison. Alexander stated that he had been unable to definitely determine the type of gun that fired the bullet, as there was nothing on which to base a written report other than the above speculation. The commission observed that while the caliber of the bullet was seemingly established, it was merely possible that Oswald's weapon could have fired it. So nothing definitive there. Now, the reason that I say, and the reason why we went from speaking about Warren Reynolds to now we are speaking about General Edwin Walker is some may say a giant leap. But I've recently come across some documents that tell us otherwise. So I've been looking and looking and looking, and I came across a transcript of an interview, a very, very long interview that one Lauren Hall gave to Garrison investigator Jaffe. And it is chock full. I mean, it's 100 plus pages long, but it is chock full of very interesting stuff. Now, excuse me, back in episode 101 called The Duff, we talked about General Walker's housemate at the time, in early of 63, a man by the name of William McEwen Duff. Now, this seemingly was a fan of General Walker and his politics and what he believed in, and who basically showed up on his door one day and said, hey, I was wondering, I really respect you and revere you. I was wondering, if I could stay here, work for you, do anything for you. So, of course, General Walker said, sure, and he used him as such. Um, Basically, his personal gopher and his houseboy and his this and his that and who knows what else. Because as you know, we come to find out that General Walker was a fan of same-sex relations. So who knows what led to the fallout between William Duff and General Walker. But if you go back to that episode and you listen, what William Duff subsequently said, because he became the number one suspect in the Walker shooting, because when Duff had left his residence, they were on very bad terms, very bad. Apparently, General Walker had done something to piss Duff off enough to where it might seem possible that Duff might want a little retaliation and take a pot shot at him. And he was picked up by the police, and well, he had left, he had fled and went to a different state, and uh, General Walker's investigators ran him down and interviewed him, and he attempted to clear himself, and he was branded a pathological liar by the detectives, but ultimately cleared of the shooting. So, but something important that William Duff stated, that while he was in residence at General Walker's home, a man by the name of Jack Ruby, and who's gave the physical description as well, had come to meet General Walker several times in late 62 and early 63, and that he was personally witness to this, and that they always met in Walker's uh, little parlor room there behind closed doors. And he is potentially the only witness who ever saw Jack Ruby meet with General Edwin Walker. Now, why is this important? Well, when Jack Ruby was arrested after he had shot Lee Harvey Oswald, and the Warren Commission came down to see him, they said, look, he told them, you get me out of Dallas. You get me to Washington, and I'll tell you whatever you want to know. But he blatantly told them, there is a society here, a John Birch society. And basically, he's not going to say anything because he's afraid of them. He's afraid they're going to kill him. Okay? Now, we all know General Walker has ties to the John Birch Society. Very heavy ties to the John Birch Society and these extreme right wingers. Okay? So, where did this fear of them come from Ruby? Unless he knew something. Unless he was told by them to silence Oswald. We'll never know the truth of what happened to Jack Ruby or why he did what he did. But he did give us clues. And it's in those clues that we must listen. And I believe it was, sometime in 1967 when General Walker had wrote a letter to someone stating the only way that Jack Ruby is getting out of prison is in a coffin, and he will. Uh, so, these threats are very real. These connections are very real. And you have to wonder exactly what was going on back then. Um, what are the connections? Why would Jack Ruby be meeting with someone like General Edwin Walker? Now we know Jack Ruby had been a alleged informer to the Nixon-headed House on Un-American Activities Committee, the HUNAC, and this was in the late 40s. And we also have proof now that as late as 59, the FBI had attempted to establish contact with Jack Ruby as an informant at least a dozen times. But according to them, Jack Ruby never cooperated as far as, ratting out anyone. Uh, we know Jack Ruby had Chicago ties, ties to the mafia. He was in a seedy underworld type business where he was traveling between states, trafficking and these strippers. And we know he did go to New Orleans. We know he visited Santos Trafficante while he was in jail in Cuba. We know he was running guns. We know all these different things about Jack Ruby. So when the more you know, the more the connections become clear about how possibly these guys could come to know each other. Because if there was a plan, a plot to kill Kennedy, if there was a plan and a plot to set up Oswald as a patsy, it was done by some very, very smart people. And we know that General Walker had connections in New Orleans with none other than Leander Perez. I'm sure he knew Guy Bannister and all the other extreme right wingers in Dallas. These guys had connections with Carlos Marcello, G. Ray Gill. The same names keep popping up, in the investigation with these people. David Ferry, you know, Thomas Beckham, Lawrence Howard, Lauren Hall. We could go on for days about this. I just don't understand why it's so hard for some people to make these connections when they keep popping up. You know, they had the motives, they had the money, and they had the mercenaries to pull this off. It just needed to be intricately planned. And of course, sitting right there in Guy Bannister's lap in New Orleans is the perfect patsy. The guy who defected to Russia, the former Marine who defected to Russia and brought back a Russian wife, the guy who's now handing out pro-Castro leaflets on the docks down in New Orleans, a guy who's, you know, supposedly training anti-Castro Cubans or helping to train them, supposedly leaving his Marine manual for Carlos Brenier and then getting into what some called a staged street fight not very long after. So we have these glaring conflicts in seemingly what Oswald was up to. And in their eyes, they're looking for somebody to take the fall. They just need to be manipulated and have ties to New Orleans and Dallas. And they had the perfect guy for the job. Only he didn't know it. Or maybe he did have an inkling of something, as far as promises. Maybe he was given some money. Maybe, of course, they lied to him. But ultimately, they set him up to take the fall for this whole thing. And it was done by some very, very smart people and planned meticulously and executed almost without a fault. So let's go back and dive in to Lauren Hall's interview with Jim Garrison. Now, this comes after a many-month attempt to not be subpoenaed by Garrison's team and fighting, in California, his extradition to New Orleans and winning. But after some attempts on Lauren Hall's life, he suddenly wanted to talk. He was forced off the road at one point and almost went over a 180-foot drop. If he had not hit a rock, a big rock apparently, he would have done just that. And a second time, there was a car traveling down the road beside him. He was going about 65 miles an hour, and the car suddenly beside him suddenly had a tire blowout, and which caused Hall to swerve suddenly, which caused basically him to lose control of the car. Now it finally came to rest against a guardrail, and upon further inspection, Hall saw that 3 out of 4 bolts of his steering column were missing. They had been sheared off, and the one remaining in his sudden jerky movement had been broken by him. And so he came to the conclusion, okay, this is almost twice that I've been trying to kill now. I'm going to go talk to Garrison and get everything out of the open, and therefore there will be no other reason to get rid of me because the story will be told. So let's move on to what he actually told them. Now, they're talking to Lauren Hall here about how he came to meet General Walker. And his answer is Robert Morris. They ask him, who took you to Robert Morris? And he says, Patrick. Now, here he's talking about Jerry Patrick Hemming. He says Patrick knew right where to go. In fact, he called him on the phone, and we went right up there. And he says something about, well, would you like to meet General Walker? Or something like this. And Patrick said, yes. This is one of the fellows we want to see. So he says, let me call this fellow here because he's a friend of Walker's. So he calls him, and I do know that he was a used car salesman, and he made the appointment for us to go there. And the next question is, you went out to Warren Reynolds' used car lot. Hall says, no, he met us, but as I recall, I remember that we met him, but I'll be goddamn if I can remember where we met him, because I remember he even talked about I'm getting supplies and sending them down to Miami. Now, there isn't much stuff that I can get, but I can get, like, food stuff. Who said this? Hall says, this used car salesman, Warren Reynolds. And he says, I'm getting, like, used clothes and food and medical supplies, and I'm sending them to Miami. This is the address I'm sending them to. And he gave it to Jerry, and I don't know who he was sending the stuff to, but anyway, he was sending that stuff. And he said that he could get us in with General Walker, so he led us there. Now, Wally, Boats, Welch, and his wife, Patrick, and myself all drove up there, and I think it was my car, and we followed Reynolds to Walker's house. And then we all went into Walker's house, and then sat down in the room, and Patrick was telling him about his group down there and No Name Key. And Walker said something about the fact that I could have had command of Vietnam if I would have wanted it, because I could have had a special forces deal over there. He then talked about some woman over in Europe that was head of a newspaper or some goddamn thing, who was the one that really screwed him up over there, and that she was a communist, and that she did everything she could to ruin General Walker and get him fired. This is another avenue that Billings told me not to mention, the fact about Reynolds. Now, Billings would have been the guy associated with Life magazine. They talked about the international brigade that Patrick wanted to get started. Interpen? Yes, Interpen. And he gave Walker, Christ, it was a book about this thick that had the background of Interpen and how it would be set up and what their functions would be. And it would be like the standard operating procedure and the modus operandi and the whole bit for the Interpen. And he gave that to Walker, and they talked about what it would take to set up an organization like this, and that it couldn't be done in this country legally, but that it could be done in Latin America. And Walker says, you're doing a good job. Keep it up, but the government's going to try to nail your ass and all this stuff. And we left. Did Reynolds leave with you? I don't know. I really don't. He might have stayed. I don't know. There's an odd organization which we've come across called the International Anti-Communist Brigade, which has headquarters in Alabama. Do you know anything about that at all? No, I don't know anything about it. So they ask again, did this fellow Warren Reynolds seem to have such an interest in the Cuban situation in Miami and so forth? Well, he told me he was gathering the equipment, clothing, food, medical supplies, and all this and sending it down. He said, I send something down at least once a month. And he says, I've been doing this for probably 7 or 8 months. And they ask him, did the name Jack Ruby ever come up at that time? And he says, no, it never came up. And it's something that when you think about it, it's absolutely amazing that I didn't actually ever meet him. I mean, really, honest to Christ. He was connected to Warren Reynolds. He said, let me put it this way. I was there, and I met that real kooky bastard, Wally Yates. I think I told you about him having the explosives in his garage, and he was a nice guy and all this, but he was like, he wanted to do something like go on a raid or something like this. He asked, like, can you leave and be back in a week? Because I can get a week's leave of absence from my job because I want to do something. I want to go blow something up. And he had the carbine in the garage with the telescope on it, and he had, I think it was 7 or 8 pounds of explosives, and he had the goddamn primer caps in the box with the explosives and everything else. So then he asked him a little bit more about Wally Yates, and they asked him, did he ever take you to Honest Joe's? Now, Honest Joe's is important as it comes up in the lore of the assassination. His very unique pawn shop vehicle was seen in and around Dealey Plaza, right before the assassination. And Hall says, well, I don't know the names of the arms places where I went to, but we went to 5 or 6. And then he asked, well, did he ever take you to a strange looking kind of pawn shop? And he said, yeah. They didn't have anything there that I wanted. Like, I was looking for automatic weapons. And then he asked, what about Reuben Goldstein? He said, well, if the man walked in here right now, as I recall, the fellow, he would have been, oh Christ, he would have probably been in his early or middle 20s. You're talking about the man at the pawn shop place. Yeah, the place where we went in. And that's about all I could tell you about him. Did you ever see this guy before? He's an acquaintance of Warren Reynolds. Apparently, at this point, they showed Hall a picture of Daryl Garner, the man who shot Warren Reynolds. Okay, they tell him well, that's Daryl Garner. The police arrested him for shooting Warren Reynolds and kept him about 6 days, and then an alibi was produced and they let him go. Let me show you a more famous picture. You recognize Lee Oswald in it, of course. This here is taken in front of the Trade Mart. There are several individuals in there we'd be interested in identifying, and I'm wondering if anyone besides Oswald looks familiar to you. There's at least one Latin person in there. Let me point him out with a pencil. Does he look at all familiar? Hall says, no, he doesn't. How about this person? Let me show you. This one here wearing the jacket. Hall says, no, I looked at this same thing yesterday, and I see thousands of people, like when I was in California. And they say, do you know a person by the name of Ronald Majid? He's a nephew of Jack Ruby. Ruby's always calling people in California. Los Angeles is all over the place. We'll get out of California. I'll get your address. There's probably quite a few I just passed over, and I'll send them to you. If you don't, I'm going to show Skip some things for his own interest that he might want to read to refresh his memory. Now, they asked him, when you made the trip to General Walker's house, did you all meet at Warren Reynolds' used car lot? And he says, no, as I recall, I don't remember where in the hell we met. We could have met in front of it. I don't remember. I honest to God don't remember. I do know that we met him someplace. Who was at that meeting? Well, Patrick, myself, and this Warren is where we met him. As I recall, we set like a time, like 9:30 or 10 in the morning, and so Patrick and myself left, and Wally Welch wanted to meet Walker also, so we took him and his wife in his car, because I had the back seat out of my car, as I recall, or else we took my car. I don't know which it was. He's not real clear on a lot of these details, but anyway, we drove to his house and met this Reynolds out in front of the house, and we went up, and Reynolds knocked on the door, And I think it was Duffy was the one who opened the door, and he let us right on it. General Walker was sitting in the other room. About the only thing that was discussed was Reynolds, as I recalled, introducing Patrick as the fellow who was just arrested in No Name Key for training Cubans, and that he'd been in the Marine Corps, and that he wants to get up an organization and wanted to meet you. So this is what it evolved around. Walker then started talking about this woman, in the newspaper and blah, 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 blah. But what's interesting there is the fact that William Duff was still in residence at Walker's house when uh, Gerald Patrick Hemming and Lauren Hall met with General Walker and Warren Reynolds. Interesting, huh? So then they ask him, well, what did Reynolds look like? I would say he was stocky, probably shorter than me, somewhere around 5'8". He was probably close to 30 or something like that, and he had a suit on. Were you ever in his office on the used car lot? No, as I recall, he worked at either an Oldsmobile or Ford place. That's all I can remember. How many meetings did you have with Warren Reynolds? Just the one. Was Hemming there? Yeah, Hemming and myself and this Warren, this Reynolds, or whatever his name is. Did Hemming say anything about Reynolds after the meeting with Reynolds, what his connection was with Walker? No, because the connection to Reynolds came through Morris, and like Patrick didn't know Reynolds. It comes out in the testimony somewhere that Warren Reynolds and General Walker did know one another. In Warren Reynolds' testimony, he admits to talking to the general about 5 or 6 times. And then they said, what did you discuss? And he said, I'd rather not say. And the Warren Commission says, oh, excuse us. Well, way to probe on things further there, Warren Commission. Not surprising at all. Now, one man I also mentioned there was Wally Yates, the the crazy sumbitch with explosives in the garage. He was living in Dallas at the time of the assassination, and Yates had read about Jerry Patrick's training of exiles in the Dallas Morning News in a 1963 article written by Larry somebody who is cut off from this article, or Larry Groves maybe, that also mentioned a Dallas supporter, Wally Welch. Yates had contacted Welch, who eventually in May or June introduced Yates to the legendary Lauren Hall. At that first meeting, Hall told Yates about the plans for another invasion and showed him some navigational maps showing the harbors of Cuba. Hall said the maps had been stolen from a federal office. Hall also told Yates at that time that he was bitter about the betrayal by the CIA of the Cuban exiles and said Kennedy was a traitor to the cause of Cuba's freedom. Again, in September of '63, Hall returned to Yates's home. The dates of that meeting are pinpointed by Yates as between the 23rd and 28th, which Yates remembered because his wife gave birth to their 4th child on September the 5th, 1963. But his wife recalls that Hall suddenly appeared at the door with a large, burly Latin-appearing man, perhaps Lawrence Howard, and another slight man, maybe William Seymour. Hall had painted his car a shiny black. Now, here the flags go up, people. We have Lauren Hall in a shiny black car in Dallas a couple months before the assassination. And if you just listen to me and Doug's new Quick Hits episode 3 and the testimony of Tom Tilson, who stated that he witnessed a possible assassin fleeing Dealey Plaza and getting into a black car on the other side of the triple underpass. Very interesting. Because as you know, we have Thomas Beckham stating that at the behest of G. Ray Gill, who was the attorney for Carlos Marcello, and associated with all these extreme right wingers in New Orleans, that he hand delivered a package to Lawrence Howard in Dallas in November, mid-November, containing photographs, drawings, and some other stuff directly to Lawrence Howard, who is associated with all this. So very interesting stuff here. Anyway, Hall had painted his car a shiny black because he told Yates' wife the federal authorities were cracking down on his gun running activities and were wise to his car. Hall was arrested in Dallas at about this time with various arms. Now, if Seymour was with Hall and Lawrence and passing himself off as Leon Oswald, this is further indication of an intelligence operation, multiple Oswald theory. Correct. But if, in fact, Oswald was not in Mexico at the end of September, and he was, in fact, as Harry Dean says, in the company of Lauren Hall and Lawrence Howard, who were told to help set up Lee Oswald as the patsy, then he was with them at Sylvia Odio's house. Yates noted that upon his return home and meeting with Hall, that all three men were grubby with beards. Again in October, Hall visited Yates. This time he was accompanied by a man who much more closely resembled Oswald. Hall wanted some ammunition and medical supplies that Yates had stored at his home, which Yates refused to give Hall. So, something's going on in Dallas. Something is going on in Dallas. You know, we have Hall and Howard staying and checking in at the YMCA in early October. We have in the middle of October, we have Lee Oswald at the YMCA in early October when he returns from Mexico. We have Jack Ruby, who works out at the YMCA all the time. We have these former dancers, that date scumbag piece of shit criminals. He could probably pay to take somebody out. Now, miraculously, of course, after being shot in the head, Warren Reynolds was told the Warren Commission that he was 100% sure the person he saw fleeing the scene of the Tippit murder was Lee Harvey Oswald. Although later, he would go on to tell Robert Groden that he, in fact, the man that he saw was not Lee Harvey Oswald. He was just scared not to tell the commission that it wasn't. He believes that someone was truly trying to take him out, trying to tell what he saw. And at the time, I don't know if they realized the connection between Warren Reynolds and General Walker was as intimate as it was. It's very interesting that he told the commission he met with them 5 or 6 times, and when they asked what about, he said, "None of your business," basically. And they didn't press him any further on the matter. So we have Warren Reynolds, who was an extreme right winger, who just happened to chase so-called Oswald, after he'd shot Tippit, after he'd allegedly shot Kennedy. And these connections, they're just too many to be a coincidence. I'm sorry. If in fact this was a right-wing conspiracy to kill John Kennedy, they had the motive, they had the money, and they had the mercs. And I don't know how to make it any more plain to anyone out there listening how this could be the most possible scenario. There's many, many theories about the Kennedy assassination and who done it, and who was behind it, who financed it. But when you hear and you read about how these guys actually viewed President Kennedy as a traitor to the country, they viewed him as a Pinko Commie loving, spineless bitch, and as a detriment to the country, a traitor. a Benedict Arnold. You can't question how these guys wouldn't hesitate to pull the trigger and not feel bad about it at all. Especially not if they were getting rewarded handsomely for their services. And, it's something to think about for sure. Something to think about for sure. And it requires some more research and investigation. And what I've given you here today is just a taste of just more odd connections. You tie what Doug calls the gunboat cowboys. We know that Felipe Vidal Santiago had met with General Walker in November of 1963 and was in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. We do not know where Lauren Hall and Lawrence Howard were in late November of 1963. We do know that they were both in Mexico after November 22nd, 1963 for a couple weeks, probably laying low. Then when the smoke cleared, hey, come on back. So, some very, very interesting stuff. The so-called right-wingers in New Orleans had definite hatred for Kennedy. Far right in Dallas had definite hatred for Kennedy. And when you start looking at the people involved in this and the seeming coincidence, Dallas was not that small, okay? It wasn't like everybody knew everybody, and there was only 20 people living in Dallas at the time, and they all knew each other, and they all saw each other. This is a city of over 700,000 people in 1963. It's staggering to think how small and intimate these connections to the extreme right wingers, to the important players in this story are. You have Jack Ruby connections, you have his stripper connections, to the hitman connections, to a witness, to supposedly not somebody not Oswald fleeing, to his connections to General Walker and the Interpen guys, and these anti-Castro organizations. And it's just too much to deny. It's just too much to deny. You have to give it the time of day. You have to look into it further. If you don't, you're not doing your due diligence. And I just don't know what else to say other than that. So, what I will say, folks, is this. As I said before, I'm going to be in Dallas, November this year. If you want to hang out, get at me. I will be there. I'll be looking forward to hanging out with you, having some assassination conversation, things of this nature. And I will be at the Capra conference that Saturday, and I will be at the dinner with Oliver Stone that Saturday. And I'm hoping to meet a bunch of new people. Hope maybe talk to some people for the podcast. That'd be cool. Hang out with you guys. Maybe do a show with some listeners. That'd be cool too. I'm going to be mobile that weekend for sure. So get at me at the Lone Gunman 7 on Twitter. The Lone Gunman Podcast at gmail.com, through email. One way or the other. Let's do it. Let's hang out. And guys, keep looking. You can take this further. The connections are there. The connections are real. And the connections make sense. Never stop searching for the truth. This is your boy. Peace.